I'm holding a regular Starbucks latte, 16 ounces. It cost me almost $6. Here's what's actually inside it. Milk, 1 shot of espresso, a cup, a lid, a little cardboard sleeve. All of it, together, cost Starbucks about 90 cents to make. 90 cents. I paid $6 for it. That's not a markup. That's a 600% markup on a product you could make at home in 90 seconds. And somehow, that math doesn't stop anyone. 40% of American adults over the age of 18 bought a cup of coffee from somewhere yesterday. A huge chunk of them walked straight past a coffee maker sitting in their own kitchen, straight past a gas station coffee for $2, and stood in a line, sometimes a genuinely long line, to hand over $6 for the same basic drink. So either 40% of American adults are bad at math, or Starbucks isn't actually selling coffee at all.
I want to find out which one it is. Because once you actually follow the money here, all the way back to where coffee itself begins, and all the way forward to a company running 40,000 stores in more than 80 countries, you start to see it. Starbucks isn't in the coffee business. Not primarily. And by the end of this, you're going to understand exactly what business they're actually in, and why that 90-cent cup of coffee was never really about the coffee at all. Let's go back, way back. Before Starbucks, before Seattle, before any of it, coffee as a drink starts in Ethiopia. There's a legend about it, and like most legends, it's probably not literally true, but it tells you something real anyway. A goat herder named Kaldi notices his goats acting strange after eating berries from a certain bush. They're jumpy, they won't sleep. So Kaldi tries the berries himself, and, well, you can guess what happens next. That's the 9th century. For a long time after that, coffee stays mostly in that region, used by Sufi monks in Yemen who needed to stay awake for long nights of prayer. And here's the thing I find genuinely interesting. The first coffee houses, the first coffeehouses, weren't really about the coffee either. They were places to gather, to talk, to argue about politics and poetry and religion. Coffee was the excuse. The conversation was the product. Keep that in your head, it's going to matter a lot later. From Yemen, coffee spreads to Constantinople by 1475. Then it jumps to Europe. London gets its first coffee house in 1652, and these places become known as penny universities because for the price of 1 cup, you could sit for hours, read the newspapers, and talk to strangers about anything. Merchants did deals there. Some of the biggest institutions in modern finance, Lloyd's of London for example, started as conversations inside a coffee house. King Charles II actually tried to ban coffee houses in 1675. He thought they were breeding grounds for political dissent, people gathering and talking and stirring up trouble against the crown. The ban lasted 11 days. 11 days, because the public backlash was so fierce he had to reverse it. Even then, coffee wasn't really about the drink. It was about what happened around the drink. Coffee crosses the Atlantic. It shows up in Boston, and one particular coffee house called the Green Dragon Tavern becomes a meeting spot for men planning something called the Boston Tea Party. So even in America's founding story, coffee is sitting quietly in the background as the drink of gathering, of plotting, of community. For most of American history after that, though, coffee stays pretty simple. Something you made at home, in a percolator, on the stove. Not an experience, not a ritual. Just a hot, bitter, functional drink you had with breakfast because it woke you up. Nobody was standing in line for it. Nobody was paying $6 for it. It was cheap, it was everywhere, and it was almost entirely unremarkable. That's the gap Starbucks would eventually walk into. Not a gap in coffee itself. There was plenty of coffee in America already. Gas stations sold it, diners sold it, your grandmother made it every morning without thinking twice. The gap was in the experience around it. Nobody had built the penny university version of coffee in America yet. Nobody had rebuilt that Ottoman coffee house, that London gathering spot, for a modern American city. Now fast forward, a long way forward, to 1971, Seattle, Pike Place Market. 3 guys, Jerry Baldwin, Zev Siegel, and Gordon Bowker, open a small shop. They're not baristas in the way we'd think of that today. They're actually inspired by a coffee roaster named Alfred Peet. And what they open isn't a coffee shop that serves drinks. It's a store that sells beans and equipment. You couldn't walk into the original Starbucks and order a latte. There was no latte to order. You bought whole beans, you took them home, and you made your own coffee. They named the store after a character in Moby Dick, Starbuck, the first mate on the Pequod.
And the logo they commissioned, from a designer named Terry Heckler, was a two-tailed siren, a mythological creature meant to evoke Seattle's identity as a seafaring port town. For an entire decade, that's basically what Starbucks was. A bean shop in Seattle, regional, small, beloved locally, invisible everywhere else. So here's the strange part. The company you know, the one with a store on nearly every corner, the one whose cup you're probably recognizing right now just from the color green, almost didn't exist. Not like this, because the three guys who started it never wanted to sell you a drink at all. Somebody else had to walk in and completely rewrite what this company was for. The company that would actually become the Starbucks you know didn't come from those three founders. It came from a guy who, at first, wasn't even in charge. Howard Schultz joined Starbucks in 1982 to run marketing, and in 1983 he takes a work trip to Milan, and something happens to him there that genuinely reshapes an entire industry. He walks into an Italian espresso bar, and it's not just the coffee that gets him, it's the theater of it, the barista who knows your name, the ritual of standing at the counter, the sense that this place, this specific physical space, is where a neighborhood's social life happens. He comes back to Seattle buzzing with an idea. Turn Starbucks into that. Not a bean shop, a cafe, a gathering space. The original founders say no. They like the business as it is. They don't want to become a restaurant, essentially, serving drinks. So Schultz leaves. In 1985, he starts his own company, a coffee bar chain called Il Giornale, named after an Italian newspaper. And it works. It works well enough that 2 years later, in 1987, when the original Starbucks founders decide to sell the whole company, Schultz is the one who buys it. For $3.8 million. He merges his Il Giornale cafes into the Starbucks name, keeps the siren logo, keeps the brand people already recognized in Seattle, and builds the whole thing around his Milan idea. He gave it a name, too. He called it the third place. Not home, that's the first place. Not work, that's the second place. A third place, somewhere in between, that belongs to neither obligation. Somewhere you go because you want to, not because you have to. This is the moment the entire 90-cent into $6 trick actually begins. Because Schultz wasn't selling coffee anymore. He was selling a seat. He was selling permission to sit in a comfortable chair for 2 hours and not be bothered. He was selling a bathroom you could use without buying anything, in a lot of cities, if you just walked in and asked. He was selling Wi-Fi before Wi-Fi was something you thought about. He was selling the version of going out that didn't cost $40 and didn't require a reservation. The coffee was the ticket price. The third place was the product. By 1990, Starbucks has 84 stores. 2 years later, in 1992, it goes public. The IPO price is $17 a share. At that point, there are 165 stores and about $73.5 million in annual revenue. Respectable, regional, growing. Then the growth stops being regional and starts being absurd. By the year 2000, there are more than 3,500 Starbucks stores. Today, there are more than 41,000 in over 80 countries, doing something in the neighborhood of $37 billion in revenue a year. $37 billion. From coffee that costs, per cup, about 90 cents to make. And here's the thing. I'd bet you're one of the reasons why. Think about the last time you were at a Starbucks. Were you actually craving that specific coffee? Or were you tired and it was raining and you just wanted 10 minutes somewhere warm that wasn't your desk and wasn't your car? Be honest, I do the exact same thing. I'll walk past a coffee maker sitting in my own kitchen to go sit in a Starbucks for 20 minutes, and it's not because their coffee is better than mine. It isn't. It's because I wanted the 20 minutes. So let's actually sit with the math for a second, because I think this is where it gets genuinely interesting. And it's not as simple as they're ripping people off. Take that 16-ounce latte. 90 cents in raw ingredients, milk, espresso, cup, lid, sleeve, sold for around $6. That leaves roughly $1.50 of actual margin per cup once you account for labor, rent, and overhead at the store level. Not the full $5 and change you might assume. A real coffee shop has real costs. Skilled labor behind the counter, rent on prime real estate, and Starbucks pays for very prime real estate, corners, transit hubs, airports, university campuses. Electricity for espresso machines running all day, milk that has to be refrigerated and replaced constantly, cups, lids, napkins, straws, all purchased at scale but still purchased. Building an individual store isn't cheap either. Estimates put the build-out cost for a single Starbucks location somewhere around $450,000, sometimes more depending on the market. In a strong location, a single store can pull in something like $444,000 of profit a year. In a weak one, it barely breaks even or loses money and eventually gets closed. So the 90-cent to $6 gap isn't pure profit sitting in a vault. A meaningful chunk of it is going toward the very thing Schultz was actually selling back in 1987. The real estate, the staff, the lighting, the music, the chairs you're allowed to sit in for as long as you want. That's not free. Somebody has to pay for the place, even if what you think you're paying for is the coffee. Think about what you're actually paying rent on for those few minutes. A corner spot in a downtown block? Square footage that a bank or a law firm would also want. Starbucks doesn't hide in cheap side streets. It plants itself on the busiest corner it can find, the one with the most foot traffic, the shortest walk from the train station, the clearest sightline from the sidewalk. That visibility costs money every single month, whether or not you buy a latte that day. And then there's the app. Something like 34 million people in the US alone are active users of the Starbucks mobile app and rewards program. That's not a small side project. That's basically a bank. People load money onto Starbucks gift cards and into the app balance. And at any given moment, Starbucks is sitting on well over $1 billion of customer money that hasn't been spent yet. Essentially, an interest-free loan from you to them because you liked the idea of skipping the line. So when people say Starbucks is just selling coffee, I think that's actually the biggest miscalculation you can make about this company. Coffee is the smallest line item in the whole operation. The real product is the system around it. But here's where it gets more interesting, because the story of Starbucks over the last 20 years isn't really the story of a coffee company anymore. It's the story of a company constantly renegotiating what it's actually selling and hitting real trouble whenever it forgets the answer. 2008, the financial crisis hits and Starbucks is not immune. Schultz, who had actually stepped back from being CEO in 2000, comes back in January 2008, right as the wheels are starting to come off. The company had been opening stores too fast, diluting what made any individual store feel special. Same day, Starbucks does something that looks almost insane from a purely financial standpoint. It closes more than 7,000 stores across the country, all at the same time, for a few hours, to retrain baristas on how to make espresso properly. Wall Street analysts weren't thrilled. Shutting down thousands of locations simultaneously means immediate lost revenue for zero immediate return. But Schultz's logic was that the company had drifted from its actual product, which, again, was never really the coffee itself. It was the experience, the ritual, the consistency of it. Profit had cratered, from $315 million down toward levels that scared the board. By 2010, after closing underperforming stores and refocusing on quality and experience, profit rebounds to $945 million. The lesson from 2008, if you want to boil it down, is that Starbucks makes money by being reliably, ritually the same everywhere. The moment that ritual gets sloppy, the moment the third place stops feeling special, people stop paying the $6 because they were never really paying for the coffee. Now let's talk about something a little uncomfortable, because I think it's important to the full picture. In 2005, Ethiopia, the birthplace of coffee itself, the country where this entire story started with a goat herder and some strange berries, tries to trademark the names of its own coffee growing regions. Sidamo, Harar, Yirgacheffe. These are specific, prized coffee origins, the way champagne is a specific origin for sparkling wine. Starbucks initially opposes the trademark filings. From a legal and business standpoint, there's a rationale for it. Trademark law and coffee sourcing agreements are genuinely complicated. But from a public perception standpoint, it looked bad. It looked like a company built entirely on the idea of celebrating and elevating coffee culture was standing in the way of the country that gave the world coffee in the first place, from controlling the names of its own farms. Oxfam gets involved, launches a public campaign, and eventually, in 2007, Starbucks and Ethiopia reach an agreement, a licensing deal that recognizes Ethiopia's right to those regional names. It's a resolved story now, but it's a useful one because it's a reminder that the company selling you the story of coffee, the tasting notes, the origin, the romance of it, doesn't always sit comfortably with the actual people and actual country where that story is true. Let's jump forward again because the more recent chapters of this story tell you even more about what Starbucks actually is. 2021 onward, a union movement starts inside Starbucks stores, something that would have seemed almost unthinkable for a company that had spent decades marketing itself around warmth, community, baristas who know your name. Workers at a store in Buffalo, New York vote to unionize in December 2021, and it spreads. Store after store across the country. The tension escalates in 2023 after the union's account posted about the war in Gaza, leading to a lawsuit and a public back and forth between the company and the union over messaging and branding. And then, starting in November 2025, workers go on what becomes the longest strike in the company's history, 131 days. Negotiations resume in April 2026, and as of the most recent information available, there are more than 660 unionized stores, and still no finalized national contract. Why does this matter to the $6 latte question? Because it's the clearest possible evidence of the tension sitting underneath this whole business. Starbucks built its entire brand on being the third place, warm, human, personal. But running 41,000 stores at global scale requires exactly the kind of standardized, metrics-driven labor management that tends to squeeze the humans doing the actual work. The company sells intimacy. The company also has to run like a machine. Those two things are in constant friction, and the union movement is that friction becoming visible. But if you want to see what happens when that friction actually loses, you don't look at America. You look at China. Then there's China. And this one genuinely surprised me when I found it. In November 2025, Starbucks announces it's selling a 60% controlling stake in its China retail operations to a private equity firm called Boyu Capital, in a deal that closes in April 2026 and values the China business at more than $13 billion. Starbucks keeps 40% ownership plus licensing rights over the brand and intellectual property, but hands over majority control of day-to-day operations in one of its largest markets. Why would Starbucks give up control of China? One word, really. Luckin. Luckin Coffee is a domestic Chinese chain that's been out competing Starbucks on price, on speed, on app-based ordering, on sheer number of locations for years now. Starbucks built its entire global identity on being the third place you linger in. Luckin built its business on being fast, cheap, and mostly takeout, no lingering required. And in China, Luckin won. Starbucks essentially admitted that the exact thing that makes it work in America and Europe, the ritual, the chairs, the slow afternoon, wasn't the thing Chinese consumers actually wanted from their coffee. So rather than keep losing that fight directly, Starbucks brought in a local partner who understands that market better and stepped back into a licensing role. That's a genuinely rare thing for a company this size to admit. The third place isn't universal, it's culturally specific. And when it doesn't fit, Starbucks would rather change its entire ownership structure in a market than force a strategy that isn't working. Which brings us to right now, to today. Brian Niccol becomes CEO in September 2024, brought in from Chipotle specifically to fix a company that had, once again, drifted. Sound familiar? It's basically the same problem Schultz solved in 2008. Long wait times, complicated menus, a mobile ordering system that had, ironically, made stores feel less like a third place and more like a pickup counter. Rows of cups lined up, customers shuffling in just to grab and leave. His turnaround plan is literally called Back to Starbucks. Bringing back handwritten names on cups, simplifying the menu, bringing back condiment bars, trying to make stores feel like places again, not just order fulfillment points. And by the second quarter of fiscal year 2026, the results start showing it. Revenue up 9% to $9.5 billion. Comparable sales up 6.2%. The first time in more than 2 years the company has managed to grow both revenue and profit at the same time. Third quarter results are due at the end of July 2026, and the company is still dealing with real headwinds. Coffee bean prices running about $1 more per pound than the year before, and new tariffs adding further pressure on costs. So here's where I land on the 90-cent question. That gap between 90 cents and $6 was never really a coffee markup. It's the price of an entire carefully engineered system. Real estate in exactly the right locations, consistent design language in every single store worldwide, a loyalty app used by tens of millions of people, a staffing model built around a specific kind of warmth, and an idea, going all the way back to a Milan espresso bar in 1983, that people will pay extra for permission to sit somewhere and belong for a while. Every time Starbucks forgets that, in 2008, and arguably again before Niccol's turnaround, the whole thing wobbles. And every time it remembers, profits climb back. Which takes us back to where coffee actually started. Ethiopian coffeehouses and Ottoman coffeehouses and London's penny universities, places where the drink itself was honestly a little beside the point. You paid for the coffee, but you were really paying for permission to sit there, for a seat at the table, for a reason to stay a while in the company of other people without anyone asking you to leave. Starbucks didn't invent that idea. Coffee has been selling that idea for over 1,000 years in one form or another, all around the world. Starbucks just figured out how to sell it 41,000 times over in 80 different countries at scale with a green siren watching over every single cup. What actually strikes me most, thinking back over this whole story, is how fragile that whole equation is. 131 days of striking workers can shake it. A faster, cheaper competitor in China can beat it outright. A few years of rushed, overcomplicated mobile orders can quietly erode it from the inside, until a new CEO has to come in and consciously bring back something as small as handwriting a name on a cup. Because the moment the ritual feels fake, the moment the third place starts to feel like a pickup counter with mood lighting, people notice. Maybe not consciously, maybe they can't tell you exactly why the $6 suddenly feels like a bad deal, but they feel it, and they start making their coffee at home again, and a company worth tens of billions of dollars has to relearn a lesson that Ottoman coffeehouse owners understood 1,000 years ago without ever writing it down. You're not selling the coffee, you're selling the seat, the pause, the 10 minutes that belong to nobody but you. The most expensive thing Starbucks ever sold you was never the coffee, it was belonging.